Hello everybody, my name is Mike the Camel and I've got a story for you today. Recently I've read the first chapter from The Righteous Mind by Jonathan Haidt. You can listen to me read the entire chapter in the link in the description below. Today I wanted to take a closer look at the contents and the people mentioned in the chapter and really analyze my thoughts on the book so far. I'll be doing this for the rest of the chapters and for the book overall once I have read the whole thing. You may be asking, why am I doing this? Well, it's simple. It's to have all my thoughts documented and to see what others people think about the book and the chapters as I read them. Additionally, as the series progresses, if you comment on the videos telling me what you think about the chapters, I can use those comments to broaden my view of the book. But since I've only gotten a couple of views on the last video and I'm not really expecting any comments to show up last minute, I'm just going to go off of what I got today, and I can hopefully articulate and illustrate what I like about the book and what I find interesting so far. So today I'm just going to focus on 3 things from this chapter: the author, the people he mentions and their ideas, and lastly, my thoughts on the first chapter. Each one of these topics will hopefully convey what I like about this book, and encourage you to buy it and read along with me as I read more of it as time goes on. So without a further ado, let's get started.
Let's start at the beginning. What is morality and where does it come from? The worst idea in all of psychology is the idea that the mind is a blank slate at birth. Developmental psychology has shown that kids come into the world already knowing so much about the physical and social worlds and programmed to make it really easy for them to learn certain things and hard to learn others. The best definition of innateness I've ever seen, this just clarifies so many things for me, is from the brain scientist Gary Marcus. He says, the initial organization of the brain does not depend that much on experience. Nature provides a first draft, which experience then revises. Built-in doesn't mean unmalleable, it means organized in advance of experience.
Part 1. The Author. In the first chapter, Dr. Haidt opens with an excellent example of what he calls a harmless taboo violation that he uses to conduct his study in Philadelphia, Alto Alegre, and Ratchev. This taboo, that of the dog-eating family. The premise is simple enough: to create a hypothetical where you try to get people to react in disgust at something to see what kind of ideology they operate on. He then explains how an educated Westerner may explain the overall morality of the hypothetical. Quote, "Well, I think it's disgusting. I think they should have buried the dog. But I wouldn't say that it's morally wrong." He then ups the ante by giving us the next hypothetical about the man who fornicates with the chicken that he bought from a grocery store before he cooks it and eats it. In both of these hypotheticals, no one saw either parties commit these disgusting acts, thereby creating a closed system where no one would be harmed other than the individuals committing these actions. He spends a good chunk of time of the chapter explaining how the fields of psychology came about before he began his work of studying morality and how most people subscribe to the Kohlbergian method of thinking. Don't worry, I'll cover that later in part 2. Finding the literature boring and dry, Dr. Haidt had a few key events that made him reconsider the psychological consensus around the origin of morality and how children truly develop theirs. He began this line of thinking when he took a class on cultural psychology and began to broaden his understanding of what other cultures and people found to be moral. This puzzled him, as many of the countries that his class studied had rules and customs that had nothing to do with harm reduction as a moral value. More often than not, many of the cultures outside of the Western civilizations had rules that sometimes encouraged harm to be done onto other people. He explained that many of the anthropologists that studied these groups and taught the class that Haidt was in explained that many of these violent and oftentimes seemingly barbaric practices were methods of relieving tension within the groups and competition with outsiders. Haidt also covers his tracks by making sure to include the abundant hypocrisy in Western civilization as well, such as the American political divide between right-wingers and left-wingers and their fixations on what some people do in the privacies of their own homes. For right-wingers, he uses an example of those who have an objection to sex outside of marriage.
I don't have a wiener! I don't have a weenie because sex is a sin!
While for left-wingers, he uses an example of those who go out of their way to ensure that everything they buy, even their food, is sourced ethically and has the right words on the packaging.
In my holistic health studies, I learned how the FDA is corrupted by the food industry and pharmaceutical companies. It's so disappointing. I don't eat genetically engineered foods. I don't like to put unnatural things in my body.
Based on his realizations, Dr. Haidt then comes to the conclusion that rationalism and Kohlbergian thought are not the only answers to the origin of morality. The question he has been trying to answer this whole entire chapter. He used the harmless taboo violations to disprove the widely believed notion in the Western world that morality is universal and that it can be taught to all people, they just have to be raised in the right environment. He also discovered that the main difference between people in all the locations that he studied was that the lower class of each city had more in common with the lower classes of the other people in the other cities, and that the world all around, the upper class thought alike as well. Going as far to say that if he really wanted to find a difference in opinion, he didn't have to fly 5,000 miles, he just had to go a few blocks west of the university. Additionally, some people thought that the actions in the hypotheticals did harm someone, even when it was explained to them that it didn't. No matter what the person was told, they still felt that the action negatively affected someone, and somehow they made a post hoc rationalization to change the scenario so that someone was harmed. In one example, the child that was being interviewed said, "Well, what if the lady drops the rags into the toilet and it gets clogged? Now she's inconvenienced more people." Or a man who was very mentally aware said, "Well, she may come to regret her decision." And that's why he thought it was morally wrong. Dr. Haidt ultimately concludes that the chapter says that morality differs from individualistic cultures and sociocentric cultures, and that a combination of an innate and learned morality exists in all of these different types of cultures around the world, meaning that most certainly people do learn morality from their surroundings, but there is something inherent to them, especially where they're born, that gives them a certain morality on top of the ones that they learn over time.
Hello, I'm David Elkind, and I had the good fortune to study with Piaget in Switzerland at the beginning of my career. In the quarter of a century since that time, I've witnessed the way in which Piaget's teachings have become part of our way of thinking about children and how they grow and how they learn.
En effet, le vrai problème de l'éducation, c'est quel est le but de l'éducation? Est-ce qu'il nous faut former des enfants et des individus qui soient simplement capables d'apprendre ce qui est déjà connu, de répéter ce qui est déjà acquis par les générations antérieures, ou bien est-ce qu'il s'agit de former des esprits novateurs, des esprits créateurs, qui soient capables d'inventer dès le niveau de l'école et ensuite pendant toute leur vie dans le domaine professionnel?
Part 2. The People and Their Ideas. Dr. Haidt explains the origin of the rationalist idea of morality, and how people like Jean Piaget and Lawrence Kohlberg and Elliot Tyrrell created an idea of universal morality based on harm reduction by studying children and teens in Western countries. Setting up a model for moral and psychological development, this model suggested that children have a morality based on harm reduction because they don't want to be harmed, and they have to slowly develop on their own in order to understand what is and isn't moral and should not be preached to, even going far as to say that you shouldn't try to blanket the oppressor children in terms of how they learn. Piaget initially observed that children at certain ages could not grasp more complex concepts and about morality and the world as a whole, and that they had to reach a certain age before they begin to understand what was actually happening in front of them, equating the conservation of volume, the ability to understand that just because some glass has water that is taller in it versus a glass that has smaller but is wider, has the same amount of liquid, to the concept of fairness. Trying to explain either to the 3-year-old was not possible in Piaget's words, and any adult trying to waste their time doing this would be a fool's errand, as the child simply wasn't mentally developed enough in order to understand the concepts fully.
The first 2 years of life make up the sensory motor period. And I'm going to put them under here. Watch me. Okay? She wants them and she'd disappear, but she doesn't think to look under the cloth. Yes, that's too bad. Okay. Here they are. See? As in the first stage of his work, Piaget was able to create tasks that other researchers could use to reveal the great discrepancy between the way in which infants and older children and adults view the world. Where's yours? And where's mine? Now, do we both have the same to drink, or does one of us have more?
I do.
But isn't this higher than this one? I mean, this is up here and this is way down here. Doesn't that make this one more?
Well, this one may be taller, but this one is more spaced out.
Okay. The third stage Piaget called concrete operational, and it emerges between the ages of 6 or 7 and lasts until the ages of 11 or 12. Beginning at about the age of 11 or 12, the adolescent period, young people move into the stage of formal operations.
Kohlberg furthered the research and the findings of Piaget and came to a similar conclusion, also pressuring parents even more to let their children develop on their own, equating to figuring out the morality to playing with cups of water and how to learn about the concepts of fairness, and not trying to be an oppressive force in their life. A very critical stage in psychology at that point, as many psychological professors were taking aim at the concept of moral teachings from the church. And Kohlberg's and Piaget's findings really gave them the ammunition they needed to really hone in on the betterment for children development against church and other proselytizing teachings. Terrell, one of the followers of Kohlberg and Piaget, then began to give children short hypothetical stories to study how they would explain their answers and give reasoning to their ideas about what actions were moral. He would tell them about a boy who would go to school in normal clothes when the school had a uniform. He would ask them whether this was right or wrong. The children would answer yes or no, but it didn't really matter what they thought was right or wrong. He wanted to know why they thought it was right and wrong. And as he soon learned that the children really did not care about this particular rule, nor did they think that it was particularly moral, as if he simply changed the scenario slightly by saying, well, the teacher gave her permission to the boy, then the children were, even as young as 5, could grasp it and say, yeah, then it was fine, thereby concluding that harm reduction was the basis of morality, as when he changed the scenario now to a girl pushing a boy off a swing, no matter how he changed it, the children still thought that it was morally wrong and universally wrong, further cementing his point of Kohlberg and Piaget that children, at least in the West, based their morality off of harm reduction. Terrell called the difference between this two types of thinking social conventions and moral wrongs. The social conventions could be changed in the minds of Western children, but the moral wrongs were set in stone, and and very hard to move them off, sometimes impossible. Using his short stories, Terrell proved that kids could be flexible in their understanding of why some rules can be broken, even at ages where Piaget and Kohlberg said that they couldn't. Remember again, Piaget and Kohlberg stated that children that are around the age range of 3 to 5 couldn't understand the concept of fairness, but yet they could understand the difference between a social convention and a moral wrong. However, Terrell still agreed that their morality was still based on harm and would really set in stone the academic consensus on the basis of morality.
In this film, however, morality is defined as fairness or justice. We will examine the development of these concepts of justice in subjects age 4 to 24. In beginning our investigation, it is important to differentiate between actions which are sanctioned by rules and conventions and those which are based upon principles of justice. The research of Dr. Elliot Turiel of the University of California has dealt with this distinction. He has found that even children as young as 4 years old can discriminate between justice and convention. To better understand this point, the following confrontation was staged. The other children did not know that Jared and Bellanne were only acting.
Jared, you don't have a smock on. You need to go get a smock on. All the other children have a smock.
No, I won't.
I want you to go get a smock on. That's the rule today. Everybody has to wear a smock.
After this confrontation, we interviewed 4-year-old Katie. The teacher asked if Jared should have put on his smock.
Do you think Jared should have put his smock on? Why?
Because Bellanne wanted him to.
Well, what if there were no rules about putting smocks on? Would it have been okay not to wear smocks then?
Yeah.
Well, let's talk about something else. What if the teacher said it was okay to hit other people? Would it be okay to hit each other?
Mm-mm.
Why not?
Because they might get hurt.
Katie thinks that students must wear smocks during art time, but she recognizes that this is a rule that can be changed by the teacher. Katie feels differently, however, about hurting others, which is a matter related to her understanding of justice. She thinks hitting is wrong, even when sanctioned by adult authority. Katie's interview illustrates the difference between morality and convention. We must keep this distinction in mind as we continue our investigation of moral development.
Eventually, Dr. Haidt explains about his time with one Alan Fisk. Fisk taught Haidt when he was taking his cultural psychology class, Fisk being an anthropologist, and Fisk was additionally advised by Richard Schwader, the main man who inspired Dr. Haidt to conduct a similar study that Terrell did, but with a twist. See, Schwader had a belief that rationalism wasn't the only answer, because as an anthropologist, he studied the psychology and how people thought abroad, and came to realize that people did not think about morality in the rationalist perspective, especially in countries like Orissa. See, Schwader tried to disprove Terrell by saying that people in different parts of the world and cultures do not have a morality based on harm. Specifically focusing in on Orissa, where he spent most of his time, he often presented Orissans and Americans similar questions and got wildly different results from all age ranges and all social classes. But when presenting these findings to the larger academic circle in psychology, Terrell quickly disproved and dismantled Schwader's findings by simply stating that the cultural differences between Americans and Orisians were that of religion, and the mere fact that people had different beliefs about how the world worked contributed to the differences in what they thought was harmful. Going for a specific example here, the widower eating a fish example. In the country of Orissa, they believe that fish is a quote-unquote hot food, and that it causes someone to be more sexually aroused. If a widow were to have sex with a man, her husband's spirit would never be able to rest, and she would never be able to reincarnate into a higher class, thereby causing harm in that scenario. Because of Schwader's oversight, his papers and studies were thrown out in the academic consensus, and harm reduction still ruled eternal. But Schwader's idea of trying to expose the difference between individualistic societies and sociocentric societies still perplex Dr. Haidt. But what are individualistic societies and sociocentric societies? Well, to put it simply, individualistic societies place the individual over the group. See countries like America. Adversely, sociocentric societies place the groups over the individual. See the Soviet Union. Overall, Schwader's main point that the difference between these two societies was the real cause and source of morality, the difference between an individualist and a collectivist. It's just that he went about proving it in the wrong way. Dr. Haidt sought to prove it correctly when he conducted his studies in Philadelphia, Alto Alegre, and Rechev, where he ultimately concluded that morality did base off these differences in the individualist and collectivist.
But as we learned from Samantha Power in her story about Sergio Vieira de Mello, you can't just go charging in saying you're wrong and I'm right. Because as we just heard, everybody thinks they are right. A lot of the problems we have to solve are problems that require us to change other people. And if you want to change other people, a much better way to do it is to first understand who we are, understand our moral psychology, understand that we all think we're right, and then step out, even if it's just for a moment, step out, check in with Sensan. Step out of the moral matrix, just try to see it as a struggle playing out in which everybody does think they're right, and everybody at least has some reasons. Even if you disagree with them, everybody has some reasons for what they're doing. Step out, and if you do that, that's the essential move to cultivate moral humility, to get yourself out of this self-righteousness, which is the normal human condition. Think about the Dalai Lama. Think about the enormous moral authority of the Dalai Lama, and it comes from his moral humility. So I think the point of my talk, and I think the point of TED, is that this is a group that is passionately engaged in the pursuit of changing the world for the better. People here are passionately engaged in trying to make the world a better place. But there is also a passionate commitment to the truth. And so I think that the answer is to use that passionate commitment to the truth to try to turn it into a better future for us all. Thank you.
Part 3. What are my thoughts? Ultimately, I think that the chapter is an interesting study in the evolution of where morality comes from, and how psychologists and the academic perspective as a whole really fixates on one answer until it is indefatigably proven wrong. After all, when Dr. Haidt did his initial study, there was no reaction to it. No one tried to disprove it, and yet no one sourced it. And this puzzled him because he was proving the exact opposite of what psychologists believed to be right at the time. And despite this, no one was seemingly using it. Which goes to show how tunnel-visioned I think our academic system can be, where if they get a solution for one question, they stick to that solution for all time until it inevitably blows back up in their face, even if other people are going out of their way to say, hey, we need to stop this. Now, the findings of this chapter really didn't surprise me too much. The fact that people have different beliefs around the world is something that I'm sure most of us are well aware of. But I did not consider the individualistic versus the collectivist idea until I read this chapter and really thought about the differences between the two ideologies. I've grown up with a lot of people that were more individualistic and more collectivistic, and I could definitely tell that they have a difference in moral opinion. Now, even within these two massive groups of morality, there is a wide spectrum of what people think is right and wrong, but you can definitely tell the difference between an individualist and a collectivist. where individualists really don't care if society is harmed as long as the individuals themselves are not being oppressed along the way, and while the collectivists don't care how many bodies they put in a hole, as long as the greater good is achieved. For many Americans, the idea of individualism is core to the American dream as a whole, and being able to pursue whatever you want in life, no matter who you are, what you believed, is a core concept in the American political identity compared to the rest of the world. After all, the founding mythos of America was that people were religiously persecuted in their home countries, and any other reason immigrated legally to the United States and began to settle it in order to create a new life in a new country. However, in countries such as India, China, Orissa, and Pakistan, and many other Middle Eastern countries, we often see this more collectivist idea of thinking where people don't really care about what you want. In fact, you are more of a cog in the machine that ultimately builds to a better outcome for everyone as a whole, rather than everyone on the individual basis. In these cultures, it's valued to be this cog in the machine, while being a lone wolf is very much not contributing towards the greater good. When I think of examples of this style of thinking, especially in these areas like China, I inevitably come across the Hong Kong protests that happened during 2019 and 2020. See, these protests were about the new bill that was passed in Hong Kong allowed their criminals to be extradited to countries such as China. The people of Hong Kong didn't like this because China could arrest and extradite any political dissidents that they deemed too dangerous to. And we can see this in other cases, such as the MMA fighter Zhao Zudong, who only wanted to prove that MMA was a worthwhile practice to pursue and wanted to expose the snake oil salesman in the Kung Fu Masters. But since these Kung Fu Masters had a cultural and thereby moral authority in China, exposing them was akin to revealing that the priests were molesting children back in the 1900s with the Catholic Church. Many people didn't want to believe that they were wrong, and yet there was undeniable proof that this MMA fighter was kicking the shit out of these Kung Fu masters, just as the reporters showed that Catholic priests were molesting children. And to the Chinese people, this was a blatant slap to the face, and the government even unpersoned Zhao Zudong, even going as far as to erase him and any records of him in not only their governmental system, but even in the schools where he learned how to fight in the first place. These collectivist countries generally do not care about a man, especially one that tries to change their corrupt ways, and will do anything and everything to prevent any dissidents from destroying the greater good. Meanwhile, the downfall of individualistic countries is that they sacrifice the group as a whole in the pursuit of protecting just the one person and their freedoms to do whatever they want. If people are free to do whatever they want, then no one is truly safe from other people's actions, which is why we don't live in a libertarian anarchy. But the overall threat of individualism is that of becoming too divided. If we all are our own individualist nations where we all are basically in these small communes, it's really easy for someone who becomes just a little bit more organized than the rest of us to come in and really oppress everyone. We can see this happen with one of the biggest empires, the Roman Empire, and how they conquered most of the world because most of the world was broken up into these small city-states, or even just tribes. This is how most of Europe was conquered by Rome. The only way that they were stopped were when these tribes only came together to become organized in order to combat the Roman Empire as a whole. And this was their downfall as individualists because eventually they fell too to the Roman Empire. I want to conclude my thoughts by saying that The Righteous Mind has given me a different perspective on how history plays out between the eternal struggle of individualism and collectivism. It really will be interesting to see how the book progresses, especially on the basis of how people think about morality, as the book is trying to sell me on. I especially like to see what the basis is for their rationalization about what is right and wrong, even if they don't have a good way of explaining it. You know what I'm talking about when you're arguing with someone, and no matter how many times you show them data that proves them wrong, they just say, no, there has to be something wrong with what you're saying. I really want to know what is the basis behind this, and hopefully the book will give me some more insight on this. But for now, I'll leave it here. I've been Mike the Camel, and don't forget to leave a like, comment, and subscribe. And while you're commenting, don't forget to tell me what you think about the first chapter and what you managed to observe when you read it or listened to me read it. Alright, until next time, weirdos. Bye.